The first time Sergeant Marko Petrov saw the man, his mind immediately categorized him the way a soldier categorizes everything in a war-zone threat. In a city that had been pounded into a labyrinth of jagged concrete, shattered glass, and twisted rebar, anything that moved was a potential enemy. There were no civilians left walking the rooftops. The people who hadn't fled the city were buried deep underground in cellars and subway tunnels, praying the artillery shells wouldn't find them so. When Marko saw the shadow standing on the precipice of a 4-story apartment block across the street, his training took over before his conscious mind could even process the image. He dropped to a knee, the rough asphalt tearing at his fatigues. He raised his assault rifle. He pulled the stock tight against his shoulder, exhaled half a breath to steady his racing heart, and peered through the combat optic. His finger hovered, millimeters from the trigger, but he didn't fire. The man wasn't shooting. He wasn't scrambling for cover. He wasn't holding a radio to call in artillery coordinates. He was just watching. Through the magnified scope, Marko expected to see the panicked movements of an insurgent caught in the open. Instead, he saw stillness. The man stood with an eerie, perfect calm, the wind catching the edges of a long, dark, heavy coat, before Marko could call out a target indicator to his squad. A cloud of grey dust blew through the street, kicked up by a distant mortar impact. Marko blinked, his eyes watering from the grit. When he looked back through the optic, the rooftop was empty. Marko lowered the rifle slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. Something about that split-second encounter felt entirely wrong. It wasn't the ruined skyline. It wasn't the omnipresent dread of the war. It was the man himself. Because in a city where survival meant staying invisible, this man had been standing in the wide open. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't running. He was standing there like he wanted to be seen. Marko didn't know it yet, but he would see this man again. And again. And again. He would chase a ghost through the blood-stained streets of a dying city, right up until the day he finally discovered the terrifying, heartbreaking truth. And by then, it would be too late to change anything. They called it the Grey Zone. The city had once been a vibrant hub of commerce, a place of bright neon signs, bustling markets, and tree-lined avenues. Now, it looked like a graveyard constructed entirely of pulverized concrete. Entire apartment blocks had collapsed onto themselves, forming massive, unstable mountains of broken stone and twisted steel. Burned-out cars lined the cratered streets, like the skeletal remains of some extinct metallic species. The war had bleached the color from the world. The buildings were gray. The smoke that perpetually hung over the skyline was gray. Even the sky seemed trapped in a permanent, suffocating overcast. Marko moved methodically down a narrow, claustrophobic alleyway, his squad fanned out in a staggered column behind him. The air smelled of cordite, raw sewage, and the unmistakable, sweet decay of things left unbouche. Every corner could hide an ambush. Every shadowed window could conceal a sniper. Every pile of trash could be masking a command-detonated explosive. "Clear left," whispered Luca, the squad's heavy weapons specialist, his voice tight with exhaustion. "Clear right," muttered Tomas, the youngest in the unit, his knuckles white as he gripped his rifle. They reached an intersection where two main avenues had once crossed. Now, it was a choke point of debris. Marko signaled for the squad to halt. He knelt behind the rusted husk of a bus and lifted his binoculars, scanning the higher elevations. Standard procedure. You always check the high ground first. He swept the glass across broken balconies and missing roofs, and then, He stopped. There he was, 3 blocks down, standing alone on the flat roof of a partially collapsed bank building. Was the man? Marco focused the binoculars, the lenses zooming in on the figure. He wasn't wearing the ragtag tactical gear of the insurgent fighters, nor the standardized armor of Marco's own military. He wore civilian clothes, dark trousers, and a heavy charcoal-colored overcoat that flapped gently in the wind. He had no weapon slung over his shoulder, no binoculars of his own. He was just standing on the edge, looking directly down the street, looking directly at Marco's squad for 3 excruciating seconds. Their eyes seemed to meet across the vast, ruined distance. Marco felt a cold prickle of sweat run down his spine. It was a look of profound, heavy observation. Then, the man turned smoothly on his heel and walked behind the remains of a brick chimney stack. Marco kept the binoculars locked on the spot for a full minute, waiting for the man to emerge from the other side. He never did. Marco lowered the glasses, his brow furrowed. Did anyone else see that? Luca shifted his weight, his armor clinking softly. See what, boss? A man, rooftop, 3 blocks north, on the old bank. Tomas and Luca both raised their optics, scanning the jagged skyline. Nothing but ghosts and pigeons. Sergeant, Luca said, his voice grating with fatigue. You seeing things? Marco looked again. Just empty concrete and broken television antennas jutting into the grey sky. Yeah, Marco muttered, though he didn't believe it. Must be the heat. Let's keep moving. But as they pushed forward, the hair on the back of Marco's neck remained standing at attention. In urban warfare, time loses its meaning. Days blur into a continuous, exhausting loop of clearing houses, kicking in doors, and sleeping in shifts on floors covered in broken glass. 3 days after the incident at the intersection, Marco's squad was tasked with clearing a residential district on the edge of the city's industrial zone. It was the absolute worst kind of fighting. Slow, methodical, terrifying. Every room had to be breached, every closet checked. The insurgents were known to hollow out the walls between townhouses, creating hidden rat runs that allowed them to flank patrols without ever stepping foot on the street. By late afternoon, the squad was completely drained. The adrenaline had worn off, replaced by a heavy, dangerous lethargy. Marco led the team through the back door of a ruined elementary school, stepping out into a small, enclosed courtyard enclosed by high brick walls. The ground was littered with children's workbooks, shattered desks, and fallen bricks. Marco took 2 steps into the courtyard and froze, standing on the 2nd story balcony of the apartment building directly across the street. Overlooking the courtyard gate was the man in the dark coat. The same coat, the same impossibly calm posture. This time, the distance was much shorter, barely 50 meters. Marco didn't use his binoculars. His rifle came up in a flash, the red dot sight settling squarely on the center of the man's chest. Contact front. Marco roared, the shout tearing through the quiet afternoon. Balcony, 12 o'clock. Behind him, the squad instantly scattered, diving behind the concrete planters and reinforced walls of the schoolyard. Weapons clicked off safe. Safeties were disengaged. The courtyard erupted into a cacophony of shouted orders and scrambling boots. But the man on the balcony didn't flinch. He didn't drop to the floor. He didn't raise his hands to surrender. He didn't turn to run. He simply stood there, an anchor of silence in the middle of chaos, and then, moving with deliberate, agonizing slowness. The man raised his right arm. He extended a single finger. He wasn't pointing at Marco. He wasn't pointing at the squad. He was pointing straight down, toward the rattan gate that served as the only exit from the courtyard into the street. Marco, his fingers still resting heavily on the trigger, allowed his eyes to dart toward the gate. At first, he saw nothing, just the rusted iron bars and the rubble-strewn street beyond. But then, the afternoon sun broke briefly through the overcast sky, casting a thin shaft of light across the pavement. A glint caught Marco's eye. A shadow thinner than a pencil. "Hold fire," Marco whispered, his voice suddenly hollow. "Hold fire." He lowered his rifle a fraction of an inch, squinting at the gate. There it was. Stretched across the bottom of the exit, ankle high, was a nearly invisible filament wire. It was strung from the gate post to a piece of debris. Pulled taut, but Marco followed the wire with his eyes to where it disappeared under a massive pile of concrete rubble and a discarded washing machine, an IED, an improvised explosive device. A tripwire. If Marco hadn't stopped, if he had led his squad through that gate, as he had planned to do exactly 5 seconds later, the explosion would have turned the narrow courtyard into a meat grinder. The blast wave would have bounced off the brick walls, liquefying their organs. Shrapnel would have cut them to ribbons. The entire patrol would have been wiped out in a fraction of a second. A cold sweat washed over Marco's entire body. His knees felt weak. He slowly raised his eyes back to the balcony, his heart filled with a chaotic mixture of terror and immense gratitude. But the balcony was empty. The faded curtains in the window behind it blew gently in the breeze. "Sergeant," Tomas called out, his voice trembling. "What is it? Where's the contact?" Marco didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the empty space where the man had been. "Get EOD up here," Marco finally managed to say, his voice raspy. "We have a tripwire at the gate. Nobody takes another step." That night, the squad rotated back to a temporary forward operating baser, commandeered underground parking garage that offered some protection from the nightly mortar barrages. The air was thick with the smell of diesel generators, unwashed bodies, and MREs being heated over chemical packets. Marco sat alone on a flipped-over milk crate, a small cleaning kit open in his lap. He was running a bore snake through the barrel of his rifle, repeating the mechanical action over and over. Though the weapon was already spotless, he couldn't stop thinking about the courtyard. He couldn't stop seeing the man's arms slowly raising, the finger pointing toward the invisible death trap. Luca walked over, carrying 2 dented canteens of purified water. He tossed one to Marco and sat down heavily on a nearby concrete barrier. Luca watched Marco's obsessive cleaning for a moment. "You're burning a hole in that barrel, boss." Marco stopped, the bore snake hanging limply from the receiver. He took a sip of the lukewarm, chemically tasting water. "You're thinking about something," Luca observed, wiping grime from his face with a filthy rag. "You've been quiet since the schoolyard." Marco nodded slowly, staring into the middle distance. "The man on the balcony." Luca let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You mean the ghost? The guy nobody else saw?" Marco didn't smile. His eyes were deadly serious. "I'm not crazy, Luca. I saw him. The same man from the bank building. Look, Sergeant, sleep deprivation does weird things to the brain. Last deployment, I swore I saw a dog talking to me on day 4 of a patrol. It happens." He pointed at the wire. "Luca." Marco's voice was low, intense. "I was looking at the balcony. I was ready to shoot him, but he pointed at the gate. If he hadn't, I would have walked us right through it. Luca's smile faded. He looked at Marco carefully, realizing his sergeant was entirely earnest. Maybe your subconscious saw the wire first. Your brain knew it was there, and it just projected a hallucination to make you stop, like a survival instinct. Marco shook his head slowly. No, he knew the difference between a trick of the mind and a physical presence. The man had cast a shadow. The fabric of his coat had moved in the wind. Deep down, Marco knew the impossible truth. The man had warned him. A civilian, an absolute stranger in a war zone where trust got you killed, had intentionally exposed himself to save a squad of foreign soldiers. But why? A week later, the fragile, tense quiet of the city shattered completely. Insurgent forces launched a coordinated counteroffensive, pushing hard to retake the eastern sectors. The radio net was screaming with panicked calls for support, coordinates for airstrikes, and medevac requests. Marco's squad was part of a quick reaction force, racing through the city streets in armored Humvees to reinforce a pinned-down supply convoy. As they entered a wide commercial boulevard lined with ruined storefronts, the world exploded. An RPG slammed into the lead vehicle of the convoy ahead of them, turning it into a fireball of twisting metal. Machine gun fire erupted from 3 different directions, the heavy caliber rounds punching through concrete walls and skipping off the asphalt like deadly hail. Ambush. Dismount. Dismount. Marco kicked his door open and rolled onto the street, his squad pouring out behind him. They scrambled behind the concrete barricades of a destroyed checkpoint, returning fire blindly into the dust and smoke. The noise was absolute. The mechanical roar of automatic weapons, the concussive thump of grenades, the screaming of orders. Glass shattered everywhere, raining down on their helmets. "Where is it coming from?" Thomas yelled, pressing himself flat against the pavement, terrified to raise his head. "All around," Luca shouted back, firing a long burst from his light machine gun toward a distant window. Marco ducked behind the barrier, ejecting a spent magazine and slapping a fresh one into his rifle. He needed a vantage point. He needed to find the command node of the ambush. He risked a glance over the concrete block, scanning the 2nd and 3rd stories of the surrounding buildings through the thick, acrid smoke, and then his heart stopped. Through a momentary gap in the black smoke, standing on a 3rd-floor iron balcony directly above the chaos, was the man. He was completely exposed to the crossfire. Bullets were chewing up the masonry inches from his head, but he didn't flinch. He stood perfectly upright, his hands resting on the iron railing, watching the battle unfold with the detached calm of a theatergoer. Marco couldn't believe his eyes. "Get down." He wanted to scream, but the noise of the battle drowned out his thoughts. The man looked down, directly at Marco. Their eyes met for the 3rd time. Slowly, deliberately, the man lifted his arm. He didn't point at the street. He didn't point at the burning vehicles. He pointed straight up, toward the roof of a blue-tiled building to Marco's deep right flank. Marco didn't hesitate. He didn't question it. He trusted the ghost. He shifted his rifle, tracking the optic up to the blue-tiled roof. For a second, he saw nothing. Then, a shift in the shadows. The unmistakable, long, dark barrel of a heavy sniper rifle protruding from a hole knocked out of the parapet wall. The sniper had a perfect flanking angle on Marco's entire squad. They were sitting ducks. Sniper. Marco roared at the top of his lungs. Blue roof. 11 o'clock, high. Luca reacted instantly. He pivoted his heavy machine gun, bracing it against the concrete, and squeezed the trigger. A long, continuous burst of heavy tracer fire tore across the sky, slamming into the parapet wall of the blue building. Bricks exploded into dust. The sniper's rifle clattered down the side of the building, followed a moment later by a lifeless body that crashed onto a rusted awning below. The immediate flank was secure. Marco whipped his head back toward the iron balcony, desperate to see the man. But the balcony was empty. The ghost had vanished back into the smoke. After the ambush, the dynamic shifted for Marco. It was no longer just a lingering curiosity. It became an absolute obsession. He knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that it wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a hallucination. The same man, appearing in different sectors of the city, always manifesting mere seconds before catastrophic danger, always disappearing immediately after the threat was neutralized. But no one else in the squad had ever laid eyes on him. Marco began to alter his behavior. He started volunteering for point position on every patrol. Instead of scanning for enemy combatants, he found himself endlessly searching the rooftops, balconies, and upper-story windows. He was looking for the dark coat, looking for the calm posture, waiting for the next warning, trying desperately to understand the mechanics of this impossible guardian angel. Weeks bled into one another. The fighting grew more sporadic, transitioning from full-scale battles to sudden, violent skirmishes in the dark. Marco's eyes grew sunken. He barely slept, convinced that if he closed his eyes, he might miss the shadow on the wall that could save his men. He pored over aerial maps of the city, trying to find a pattern, a home base, a logical explanation for how one unarmed civilian could navigate a war zone so freely without being killed by either side. There was no logic to it until, finally, the ghost decided it was time to speak. It was deep into the night. The city was uncharacteristically quiet. The mortar had stopped hours ago. Even the feral dogs had ceased their howling. The only sound was the crunch of glass under Marco's boots. His squad had just secured a block of row houses and was setting up a perimeter for the night. Marco told Luca he was going to walk the alleyway behind the houses to check for secondary access points. He walked alone, his rifle held loosely at the low ready. The moonlight cast long, jagged shadows across the brick walls. Marco reached the end of the alley, and suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the wall. Marco's rifle snapped up, his flashlight illuminating the figure. It was him, the man in the dark coat, but this time he was barely 10 feet away. And this time, he didn't disappear into thin air. They stood face to face, locked in a standoff of absolute silence, up close. Marco finally saw the man clearly, stripped of the distance and the smoke. He was older than Marco had assumed. Deep lines etched his face, mapping out years of exhaustion and grief. His beard was graying, his eyes ringed with dark circles, but his eyes were the same, deep and incredibly tired. "You've been following us," Marco said, his voice a harsh whisper, echoing slightly in the narrow alley. The man didn't flinch at the blinding light of the weapon light. He slowly shook his head. "No," the man replied. His voice was gravelly, carrying a heavy, local accent. "I've been warning you." Marco frowned, lowering the rifle just enough so the light wasn't directly in the man's eyes. "Why? Why us? You're exposing yourself to crossfire. You're exposing yourself to me. I almost shot you 3 times. The man looked away, his gaze drifting toward the distant broken skyline of his city. Because this war is killing everyone, he said softly. It wasn't a statement of anger. It was a statement of profound, inescapable sorrow. Marco studied him. He swept his light down the man's body. No chest rig, no holstered pistol, not even the outline of a knife in his pockets. "You're not a fighter," Marco said. "No," the man agreed. "I am a teacher, or I was." "Then why are you out here? Why risk your life to help foreign soldiers?" The man took a deep, shuddering breath. He looked back at Marco, the moonlight catching a glimmer of moisture in his eyes. "Because my family lives here," the man answered. He raised a hand and gestured toward the devastated buildings around them. "The rubble, the craters. When you soldiers walk blindly into an ambush," the man explained, his voice steadying, "the fighters shoot at you. You shoot back. You call in your artillery. You drop your bombs. And the fighting spreads. It spreads into our streets. It tears through our walls. Every time you get surprised, a city block burns." Marco stood frozen, the realization hitting him like a physical blow to the chest. He understood now. The man wasn't a guardian angel sent to protect Marco's squad. He didn't care about their military objectives. He wasn't taking a side in the geopolitical conflict. He was simply trying to prevent firefights from happening in his neighborhood. "All those times," Marco whispered. "The tripwire, the sniper. You were watching the insurgents set up the traps." The man nodded slowly. "I know this city. I know the rooftops. I watch the young men with guns move through the shadows. I see where they hide their bombs. And when I see a patrol walking toward them, I try to make sure you notice the trap before you spring it." Marco felt a complex, suffocating wave of emotion. Gratitude, yes, but also immense guilt and a deep, aching sadness. "If the insurgents catch you warning us," Marco said, "they will execute you in the street. You know that." The man smiled faintly, a tragic, fleeting expression. "Everyone here could be executed in the street, Sergeant. I am just trying to ensure my children wake up tomorrow without the roof collapsing on them." They stood in silence for a long moment, two men from completely different worlds, bound together by the terrifying math of urban survival in the distance. The sharp staccato pop of gunfire broke the quiet night. The war was waking up again. The man looked toward the sound, then took a step back, retreating into the deep shadows of the alleyway. "Wait," Marco said, stepping forward. "What is your name?" The man paused, half swallowed by the darkness. He looked over his shoulder. "Yusuf," he said quietly, and then, with a silent grace that defied the rubble-strewn ground, he was gone. Wars, like all violent storms, eventually move on. 2 weeks after the encounter in the alley, the strategic reality of the conflict shifted. The enemy forces, bled dry by constant attrition, began a disorganized retreat from the eastern district. The heavy fighting slowly migrated to the rural provinces in the north. Marco's unit received their orders. They were being rotated out of the city, sent back to a staging base across the border to refit and recover. It was a bleak, overcast morning when the convoy of armored vehicles rolled through the ruined streets one last time. The city looked even more desolate now, stripped of the terrible energy of active combat. It was just a monument to destruction. Marco sat in the turret of the lead Humvee, his hands gripping the handles of the heavy machine gun. But his eyes weren't scanning for threats. He was looking up. He scanned every balcony, every broken roof, every shattered window frame. He was desperate for one last glimpse of the dark coat, one last silent acknowledgement, but there was nothing. Just broken masonry, flapping tarps, empty concrete. The streets were silent. And for the first time in months, Marco felt the profound, lonely realization that no one was watching over them. War literature is overflowing with stories of enemies. It details the tactics of the ambush, the psychology of the sniper, the brutal intimacy of close-quarters combat. But sometimes, the defining force in a soldier's survival isn't the man trying to kill him, or even the squad mate fighting beside him. Sometimes, the person who saves your life is someone who absolutely refuses to pick up a weapon. Marco never saw Yusuf again. He returned home, carrying the physical and mental scars of the grey city. He often wakes up in the middle of the night, staring at his bedroom ceiling, wondering what happened to the teacher. He doesn't know if Yusuf survived the final days of the occupation. He doesn't know if his family made it out of the rubble, or if, perhaps, Yusuf is still out there, walking the perilous ledges of some other broken city, watching another pointless war unfold, risking everything to keep the fire away from his door. But there is one truth Marco Petrov holds on to with absolute certainty. Without that mysterious, unarmed man appearing on the rooftops again and again, Marco and his squad would have simply been more bones, buried in the concrete of the grey zone. If you enjoy powerful war stories like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more intense military storytelling. And tell me in the comments, do you think the soldier would have survived without Yusuf's warnings? Because sometimes, the battlefield hides heroes no one ever sees.